Welcome to our Profiles in Leadership series. This series offers an unparalleled opportunity to glean insights from top leaders who serve in government, education, the private sector, and civil society. In each episode, we invite these leaders to reflect on their journey and share skills, core values, and qualities that make them the leaders they are today. Today, we're very pleased to have Arti Rai. Arti is the Elvin R. Latty Professor in Law and Faculty Director of the Center for Innovation Policy, Duke Law. She is an internationally recognized expert in intellectual property law, innovation policy, administrative law, and health law. She has served as senior advisor on innovation law and policy issues with the Department of Commerce Office of General Counsel. She also regularly advises other federal and state agencies as well as Congress on these issues. She has headed the Office of Policy and International Affairs at the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. In that capacity, she led policy analysis of the patent reform legislation that ultimately became the America Invents Act, and worked to establish the USPTO's Office of the Chief Economist. Welcome, Arti.
Thank you so much, Daryl. Pleasure to be here.
I want to start with a talk that you gave recently in April on IP and national security. And there you shared an interesting statistic. In 1960, the US underwrote 1/3 of the world's R&D. And now it's a lot smaller. Are we headed in the right direction?
It's a great question. I think that there is a lot of reason for concern, and both the private and the public sector in the United States, I think, need to step up. Some of the recent legislation has been heartening in my view. So, for example, the CHIPS Act, which tries to set up an infrastructure for domestic semiconductor research and manufacturing, has gotten underway, and my colleague at Duke, Ronnie Chatterjee, is actually currently managing that program out of the White House, although he's going to be returning to academia soon. So that's very exciting, and as he returns, we're going to have a lot of programming with him. The and science part has not been funded thus far. However, it was the CHIPS and Science Act and the and science part, which is supposed to be more broad-based and give a lot of funding to NSF, in particular, the National Science Foundation. That has not yet been funded. It was, in the language of Congress speak, it was authorized but not appropriated. And appropriation is, of course, when the money comes. So that worries me a bit. That's a little bit of a micro kind of set of challenges right now. But more generally, I do think that we, as a country, are less unified on this set of questions than we should be. This should be a very, very bipartisan, relatively apolitical enterprise, in my view anyway, because we all know that innovation is the key to all of the things we want in life: economic growth, well-being, safety, peace and security, all of those things. And so it should be a bipartisan issue, and to some extent has been, but not as much as it should be.
So this is a podcast about leadership. Let's talk about the leadership aspect of what you just said. What can we do? When I say we, I mean as a country, but also in terms of sector, in terms of Congress. What can we do to really focus our minds on moving the ball forward?
So I do think that there has been a lot of good energy in that direction, in the sense that the relevant players in Congress did get together in a bipartisan way in a non-election year to pass the CHIPS and Science Act. I think it's harder once you get to election years and appropriations. As academics, because I'm back in academia right now, and in the context of my center, for example, what I am trying to do is bring together, in a bipartisan manner, individuals from both sides of the aisle and have them talk about what they agree upon. So one of our first programs this fall is going to be on execution of chips manufacturing, and standing up of fabs, semiconductor fabs. And that's just got to be a win-win-win all around. And the more we can tout that, as bringing good jobs in the United States and improving our economy, improving our national security. Part of it is a communications exercise, I think, because scientists don't tend to be great at communicating, and perhaps some of us who are law professors and certainly science policy analysts in the DC arena should do the communicating for some of those scientists, because the scientists tend to be, I think, a little more focused on the actual day-to-day research.
Do we need more platforms so that policy people and scientists can meet and mingle and actually get those channels of communication established?
Absolutely. I mean, I do think that we have some good places like the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine where there is a convening role to be played, but sometimes in the heat of the DC bubble, it's harder to get people to speak candidly. And that was one of the reasons why when I came back from DC in 2011, I wanted to set up the Center for Innovation Policy, because we're slightly outside the DC bubble. Now, Duke does have a DC office, so we can always host events there. It's actually has a nice conference center there. But we're also outside the DC bubble enough that I think we can get people to perhaps get off their talking points a little bit and actually speak to the fundamentals that sometimes they agree more than on their talking points, because the fundamentals are, I think, reasonably apolitical in the sense that we all want economic growth again and peace and security.
I want to go back to that figure that I mentioned earlier, the 1/3 of the R&D that the United States was responsible for in the 1960s. At that point in time, the United States actually accounted for 40% of the world's GDP. Now it's a lot less, of course. You get a sense, and this goes to, again, the issue of leadership, that, well, we're not really benefiting as much from the global commons. So why should we contribute? And you mentioned, I think very aptly during your talk, that as a result of the investment, we had the internet, we had Silicon Valley. And right now, in terms of facing the challenges of climate change, the next pandemic, there are all these global issues which we need global leadership on, and the United States seems to be retreating. Is that your sense of what's going on? And if so, what can we do to address these macro forces?
So I'm not sure the United States is retreating, but it's certainly not the single leader that it was. I mean, the Soviet Union obviously was there in the 1960s, but I think we know in retrospect that it really wasn't doing that much research and development outside of a narrow slice of the military sector. So these days, China is obviously a powerhouse in R&D, and we know that we're going to have to cooperate with China in order to meet some of these global challenges. And these challenges should, presumably, particularly climate change, should not be challenges upon which, again, the actors disagree on fundamentals. And that is where I hope anyway, that there will be cooperation between what are the two economic superpowers today, U.S. and China. There will be rivalry in other spheres, but with pandemics, with climate change, with the sort of things that involve human health, presumably that's not a zero-sum game in the same way that perhaps other issues sometimes become a zero-sum game. And regrettably, sometimes I think, economic growth can be seen as a zero-sum game, and it's at least in its narrow sense of with the focus on trade, but not not human health, I would hope, and not climate change, I would hope as well.
So in the talk, you also talk about uh, two axes. You have the protection axis and you have the commercialization axis, national security and intellectual property. Where do they intersect?
So it's a very interesting question because on the one hand, intellectual property, specifically secrecy and the regimes of trade secrecy, are very consistent with national security interests in that we're talking about protection of information from really to the largest extent possible and from to the largest group from the largest group possible. The where we get, I think, more tension is in the context of patents, because patents are obviously premised in part on disclosure, and patents are a very important means of disclosure, at least in certain industries. In addition, patents are a much better mechanism, in my view, for commercialization than secrecy and trade secrecy. I mean, you can get some trade secret licensing going and some dissemination of information for purposes of commercialization in that context, but it's a lot harder. And patents, I think, have been shown time and again to be a really good infrastructure for transferring ideas in a safe way, at least for purposes of commercialization. Now, the challenge becomes national security, because patents don't really protect national security, at least to the extent that they're actually disclosed. Now, there's some patents that are held secret for at least a period of time because of concerns about national security, but to the extent they're actually performing their function, they involve disclosure. And so that's a challenge, because when you're talking about a situation where you really want to get particularly federally funded research of the sort that you began your set of questions with commercialized, boy, is that the way to do it. You need patents. That's what the Bayh-Dole Act was all about, setting up universities as a place where scientists and universities could secure patents so that they could license them out for purposes of commercialization. If universities are doing highly national security sensitive research, they can't seek patents on it. And frankly, the professors can't publish on it either, so that creates tensions with norms of academia as well. Patents are much more consistent with publication, obviously, because they allow, after filing a patent application, one can publish. But one can't do that if you're talking about secrecy, whether for reasons of national security or for reasons of commercial interests.
Do you think universities are naive when it comes to national security and system integrity?
That's a very good question. I can't say that I have full information on that issue personally, but I've talked to lots of people who do think universities are naive, certainly people in government, and you know, it's hard for me as a person who doesn't currently have access to a lot of classified information, or really any classified information right now, to adjudicate the dispute between the folks I speak with in government who say that universities are naive, and then university personnel who say that government officials tend to overclassify and think that everything or everyone is a national security threat. And so, but they're respected people, I think, who I've known for a long time, who have said that universities, at least at various points, have been naive.
So let's switch gears and go way back. You gave an interview and you talked about how when you were in high school, one of the things I can say equivocally, you said, is I still think the best teacher I ever had was at Clayton High School.
Yes.
Talk about your formative years and how you think they shaped you in terms of the leader that you are today.
Sure. So going back even slightly further, my family immigrated from India when I was 6, and as you might imagine, because of the trials and tribulations of immigration, my parents emphasized the values of perseverance and hard work and preparation, and I think that is key to being a competent leader because unfortunately, I think some leaders think that it's all about kind of communication and not necessarily about how much preparation you put in. And I'm not sure that's the case. I think it's both. I think it's both preparation and communication. So the hard work and preparation, I think, was core in terms of my thinking about leadership. There's also the boldness piece of it. I mean, I think anyone who immigrates from another country, particularly as my parents did at a relatively advanced age, has to be a little bit bold, and that was something that I saw from them. My mother was a physician, relatively well, few women at that time were physicians, and she came here to further her career. My father was a software professional, similarly wanted to further his career. But they were also both very empathic individuals, and I think they taught me empathy as well. More than anything, though, I would say open-mindedness because they were from two different religious backgrounds, and India is a very religiously divided country, and so to be brought up by individuals who were open-minded enough to marry each other in that country was really quite enlightening. And I think being a leader requires being open-minded, being willing to listen to different points of view. Ultimately, of course, one has to decide, and so I probably err a little bit too much on the side of being open-minded as opposed to decisive, but there is that balance that has to be struck, and I think both aspects of that, both traits are important. So, and then finally, last but not least, as you mentioned, my favorite teacher of all time was my chemistry teacher from high school. And he had a great saying that, you know, you always, it was a great series of sayings, basically. You always show up on time, you always show up prepared, and you always show up to do your best. And needless to say, that was very consistent with the values I've been taught from my parents as well. So, so that was fortunately Clayton High School for me was a very kind of value affirming experience in that respect.
Fascinating. So, a few questions to follow up just on that. How did your parents manage to keep the peace in at home? By did they create a how did they create a sufficiently uh, large area of common space so that two people of different religions could bring up children that uh, could be open-minded?
Well, I think that, and this is where I have to say that I really admire them for doing this. I think that they really wanted us to value what was great about all different types of cultures, because you know, there is it seems a little bit trite, but it is also the case that in all traditions there is an emphasis on being a good person and um, being kind and being respectful, and you know, regardless of whether you know, there's a particular God in which one believes or one believes in a God at all. I think kindness and respect and caring are values that are held in all traditions. And so that was, and in their case also, this is not so much a religious value so much as a value that they held dear, which was like, you know, you work yourself to the bone if necessary, because that's what's necessary to achieve something in life and to be excellent. So excellence was a value that was perhaps stressed above all.
And then on hindsight, how did you draw that balance between decisiveness and being open-minded?
So as I said, may have erred at various points on the side of being slightly too open-minded, but I think that there was somebody a while ago when I was in a fellowship who told me something that I thought was very useful, that you can make decisions and you should make decisions, but you should always recognize that decisions can be revisited at later points in time when there's new information. Not willy-nilly, and any little piece of new information shouldn't change your course of action. But if there's fundamentally new information, decisions can be revisited. So it's, this is sort of the Bayesian updating that we as academics think we should always be doing. And I think that when I applied that set of principles to my personal or professional life as an individual, that helped me a lot to realize that I could be decisive without being having set myself into a course for life.
That there is a second chance, there's a U-turn. How would you phrase it?
Um, there's opportunity for revision or adaptation. Maybe adaptation would be the way to think about it, because there is in the administrative law literature, as you know, I teach administrative law and sometimes write in it. There is this notion of adaptive regulation. You set out a regulation or a guidance or what have you, but it can be adapted over time as circumstances evolve. And so I do like that idea of adaptation, which of course ties into all sorts of notions of evolution and the sorts of things that I studied as an undergraduate in biochemistry.
And how much of that has informed your philosophy on parenthood?
On parenthood, I hope it has informed it a lot. Although my older daughter was just saying to me the other day that I hadn't internalized adaptation as much as I should have, and recognizing that at a certain age, one doesn't have to be constantly working. And that
I as in you, or I as in her?
I as in me. So I hope it's informed my philosophy of parenthood as well. I do think that being a parent is a very humbling experience, because no matter what you do and how you do it, you're probably never going to think you did it well enough, and your children certainly aren't going to think you did it well enough. So,
well, since we're on the topic of family, let's talk about Professor Stuart Benjamin. You know him.
Yes, I do, just slightly.
Tell us about this rather unique partnership.
So we met in a very, very trite and boring way. We were both lawyers at the Department of Justice, and as you might imagine, that was not the sort of story you tell people when you want to elicit visions of huge romance and flowers and lovely music playing in the background. But it was a great way to meet in a lot of other respects, because we really had an intellectual meeting of the minds when we were friends prior to becoming involved as dating in the dating enterprise. I would commend it to anyone as a great way to meet, not necessarily the Justice Department per se, but meeting somebody as a friend, as an intellectual kind of partner, because I do think that, at least in my view, one of the best things about marriage is that you get to have an intellectual partner for life, and they don't go away. They don't have to move to another city to get another job and so forth. So so that's how it happened. And then we went on the teaching market together, and so we've been academic partners in that sense since we got married.
How do you avoid bringing work home?
Well, it's a great question. In some ways we do bring work home, but this is why being an academic is so great, because, anything, as you know, Daryl, anything can be work in a certain sense. Like, if we're talking about the challenges of climate change, that's work, because of course it's related somehow to our views on innovation and our views on how we set up an infrastructure to develop the technology that's needed to generate green innovation. And so it's wonderful when the work can be so many things. The one thing that, one should not bring home, and I hope we don't, and we really do try not to, is, any sort of petty politics or what have you that arise, I think much less so in academia than in other areas of the world, but can arise in academia, at least on occasion as well.
I can see where your daughter's observation comes from.
Yeah,
well,
no,
you need to work on that adaptation, because not only are you colleagues, you actually co-write articles together.
Yes. And in fact, the article that probably was the most impactful in terms of public policy was one that I've written. It was one that was co-written with Stuart. It was the article on post-grant proceedings at the patent office that we wrote prior to my going into the USPTO and then working on the predecessor to the legislation that ultimately became the America Invents Act. I was out of the position once it passed, but I worked on the policy analysis of that legislation.
So that act passed, I think, 2011, came into effect 2012 or 2013.
It came into effect in part in 2012 and in part in 2013. So there were parts of it that were implemented in 2012, and then the PTAB itself, which was the major piece of it, the Patent Trial and Appeals Board, was the 2013.
So we have had 10 years now of data points. Look back and tell us, PTAB, the whole structure of the AIA, has it worked out the way that you intended it?
I don't think that any single person could say that they had their imprint on the legislation completely, because it was a grand compromise. It was a product of so much compromise from so many different actors, as most legislation that's really major has to be. And so, I can't say that, for everyone, there were things in it that they might have done a little bit differently. And so, being who we are, we tend to point to the stuff that we might have done a little bit differently and say, oh, well, if I had done it my way, then, for example, there would have been better coordination between district court litigation and the PTAB. And so one of the challenges that I've written about with my colleague, Sarah Vishnubak, is, or my former colleague, Sarah Vishnubak, is the fact that, there is duplication in the system, and some of that duplication, I think, could have been foreseen a little bit better than it was. So, had, for example, there been some better mechanism for ensuring stays of proceedings either in one branch or the other when duplication was occurring, that would have been a good thing. But that was, in the product, as a product of compromise, it ended up not getting as much attention as it should have, perhaps, because legislation was a product of compromise and that wasn't the focus necessarily at the time. I think that the coordination issue is a significant one that is still evolving. The other challenge, and this was unexpected on my part, was the extent to which the administrative law infrastructure is shifting even as we speak, as a consequence of changes at the Supreme Court, I think, largely. So as you know, there have been 6 challenges brought to the PTAB, not all constitutional, but all administrative law related, that have made their way to the Supreme Court. And those challenges, in my view, couldn't necessarily have been anticipated as challenges that would go all the way to the Supreme Court, simply because I think that in a lot of ways, I'm actually planning to write an article called The PTAB on the Choppy Waters of Administrative Law. In a lot of ways, the last 10 years have been the most choppy period in administrative law that I think we've seen probably since the 1970s. And so that, I don't know that could have been anticipated that, it did seem like administrative law, at least circa 2010 or so, was a reasonably bipartisan enterprise, and Justice Scalia was a major figure in administrative law who believed in fairly traditional principles of administrative law. It has now become administrative law has now become an arena where people have huge ideological conflict, and that wasn't the case back 10 years ago. Or
How do we bring that back to the center?
That's a really good question, and that's one thing that I'm going to be thinking about this summer, and then going into the fall as I have a research leave. The PTAB on the choppy waters of administrative law is intended to not only be an examination of patent law and the PTAB, but also to think about how administrative law more generally might be brought a little bit more back into the center. Again, because I think that there is common ground to be found, and I think the common ground has to be in the context of recognizing that for factual determinations that are highly technical or scientific, there's no substitute for some level of expertise. I don't think one can say that a generalist judge can make determinations, whether in patent law or with respect to the appropriate levels of a particular pollutant in the air, with the same level of sophistication as somebody who has a PhD in the relevant science. And so if we can go back to the idea, which was an idea of an earlier article, that there is a lot of scientific fact in the law. If we can just agree on that part, then maybe we can make some progress. Regrettably, I'm not sure we can agree on that part, but that's what I intend to continue to want to argue for, because to some extent, whether one is on one side of the ideological spectrum or the other, at some point one is going to have to rely upon some scientific facts, and hopefully there will be some agreement, some overlapping consensus on some of those scientific facts.
So I can think of two grounds of objection.
Uh-huh.
You would have the Republicans that say what you're advocating for is an expansion of the administrative state. What we don't want is big government, and you're advocating for big government, therefore we're going to vote against it. And then you have the judges that say, well, it's bad enough with the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. We've been dealing with all manner of complex litigation, from tax to multi-district litigation and what have you. We don't need another diluting of the power of the judiciary. So what would you say in response to that?
Yeah, no, those are very salient considerations, and certainly arguments that I've faced really throughout my academic career, in terms of, because I've been writing about this fairly openly for a while now. And I think that on the, is this the from the Republican side, is this the mushrooming and total takeover of big government? I don't think it has to be. So, one of the geniuses, or the genius aspects of patent law, is that it does rely upon the market so significantly. So if we can get a lean agency to issue patents properly, there doesn't have to be that much more that is done in terms of quote unquote industrial policy or whatever else Republicans might dislike. Patents are a very market friendly tool. So at least in that sense, one can have a fairly lean operation and then rely upon the market for the rest. So at least for patent law, that works now. And in the environmental arena and other areas where, I think Republicans are probably much more suspicious of agencies, it probably doesn't work as well. But at least for present purposes, I'm focusing on patent law. On the diluting of the judiciary, so I had my former dean was a federal district judge, and he spent a lot of time telling me that I was trying to dilute judicial power. And I clerk for a federal district judge, so I understand. And in my view anyway, I think that it I don't think most federal district judges at the end of the day are really wanting lots more work. And so it seems to me that they can have lots of power in the arenas where their expertise in history and study of institutional structures and political science and all of those good things um, really are absolutely critical. Um, they can have lots of power in that context. I don't think they need power over scientific fact. And I don't think they'd want power over scientific fact. I don't think that they really want to be determining, details of how, quantum computing is working in a particular patent. It just doesn't seem to me that most federal district judges want that. Now, the Federal Circuit might be intrigued and interested, and that's great because I think that you need someone in the judiciary who's interested, but I don't think it needs to be federal district judges.
So let's talk about advocating for yourself when you are part of the bureaucracy. You're part of the USPTO, you're part of the Department of Commerce. How do you get your agenda on their agenda?
So you need to have synergy. So that's another trite word, but it absolutely needs to be there. You need to figure out how is it that my agenda is synergistic with something that somebody who's actually important wants. So you you obviously, as an academic, you know that academics aren't necessarily always thought of as the most welcome people in Washington, D.C. And so you have to become.
Wait, let's just pause there. Why
Okay.
not?
I think academics are seen as impractical and perhaps more ideological than should be the case. And those criticisms, by the way, are not completely unfounded. I should be clear that there are reasons to be concerned about that in terms of academics going into government. And so one needs to have a lot of humility as well as an academic going into government because it's very different from writing an academic article. Obviously, getting any kind of policy change actually implemented is extremely different from writing an article and requires lots of compromise. Getting your agenda on the table means probably diluting it to some extent because you're seeking synergy with other people. And dilution in this context shouldn't be a dirty word. Maybe you could come up with another phrase for it, like harmonization or compromise or what have you. But in some ways it is dilution. But I think that's okay. That's the political process, and that's the way one should think about being an academic in government. One should not think about, I'm going there to show these people what I know and how they should do things differently, but rather, what are their issues? What are they concerned about? And, what are real challenges that they're facing on a day-to-day basis? And does my agenda fit in with any of that in a meaningful way?
Do you think that when people go into a negotiation, accepting the fact that it's going to be a dilution of ideas encourages them to think tactically and say, well, actually, this is my view, but I'm going to advocate for a more extreme view because eventually it's going to be diluted. And the other side would think that they're getting something, but eventually I'm getting what I want.
So that's one theory of negotiation, and I don't adhere to that theory of negotiation because I think that if you go in guns blazing, in my view anyway, that leads to a freezing over of relations, and it makes the situation adversarial from the outset. So I don't believe in that theory of negotiation. That said, I mean, yes, one needs to be, in my view anyway, not don't immediately, bargain with yourself. Take your position in a manner that is consistent with what you believe and not so diluted as to already be the compromise. So, you know, I think there's a happy medium in there, maybe an unhappy medium, but it's a medium anyway, between going in guns blazing and going in having bargained with yourself and, you know, setting forward the compromise, which will then get further diluted, obviously, if your position is already the compromise position.
So I imagine, and tell me if I'm wrong, it's also really important to understand the institutional culture of the places that you're at. You're the USPTO, it's different from the Department of Commerce. When you are talking to Congress, that's different from both of those. So how do you channel, how do you transmit in multiple frequencies?
Yeah, no, it is. It's very challenging, and that's one of the biggest challenges, I think, of trying to be an academic in a political enterprise. And I don't mean political in a bad way. I mean, you know, our system of government is a political system. We don't have a government by dictatorship or what have you. So so yeah, so you have to, I think, without being inconsistent, so that you can't say things that are different because can obviously check you, particularly in this era where everything is recorded. You can't say things that are inconsistent, but I do think, again, you have to, it's a matter of emphasis. So and also role. So for example, when I was at the USPTO, I was in what's known as an org chart position. So it was a position that was and is in the organizational chart. So it has certain established responsibilities that are completely independent of the occupier of the position. So you have to be aware of that as well if you're in an org chart role. Whereas being an advisor is slightly different, and one can be a little more free and easy in terms of either being more persistent um, and as a consequence less diplomatic in certain contexts. But as an org chart position holder, one has to be extremely diplomatic and try to be as consistent as possible, and perhaps not be as persistent in certain contexts.
And how different or similar is that from being on the presidential transition team?
It's very different. The being on the presidential transition team is like drowning with an occasional gasp of air, you know, every few days or so. It's just such a short period of time, and particularly when you're transitioning from one political party to the other, as my transition experience was in the Obama administration. You only have about a month to get everything. You're sort of prepping even before the election if you think that there's some real possibility that your candidate is going to win. But after the election, going in, you have to go into the agency, get a sense of everyone in the agency, what the problems are, what the challenges are, what the outgoing leadership sees as the challenges. Um, Merge that with the views of higher ups who are doing transition at the Department of Commerce level, which in turn has to merge with those who are doing transition at the White House level. And all of that has to be translated into a memo that'll go to the incoming leadership of the administration to whom you're directing the memo within about a month.
And for those, no, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. No.
For those of people who are thinking of being part of a presidential transition team, is there a playbook? How do you start in the process? How do you get involved? And how do you make sure that you continue to be involved as things go along and not drop off the train?
So what you need to do is, I mean, there is no single playbook. Regardless of how hard you try, there's a lot of randomness in the system, and you might be, you know, the most personable, brilliant individual going, and nonetheless not get picked up or also get dropped off for reasons that have to do with just sheer random luck. That said, you know, I do think that if there's a candidate in whom you are particularly interested and about whom you feel particularly passionate, start early. Start early with even with the primary season, which is in the context of Barack Obama. I happen to know him a little bit from law school, and so got involved at the when he was a very much an underdog candidate in the primary context. So that's, it helps to go with an underdog who then happens to win, because they don't have that many people and layers of individuals that they've accumulated, who are their trusted advisors, who are probably very good and don't need to be replaced by anyone else. But if you're going with a newer face, and President Obama at that time was a very new face, that's much more likely to yield something.
Did you accomplish all that you wanted?
In the PTO position, yes, I did, kind of over the course of the years. So I would say that David Kapos, actually, who was the PTO director, really completed the execution, or executed the America Invents Act ultimately. And that's why he's in the picture with President Obama, as President Obama is signing it, as he should have been. So, obviously it was very much an effort of many, many, many people, but fortunately my views and goals were synergistic with those of those other people. And yeah, so I was really pleased with that. I was also, as you mentioned, the chief economist position is a little bit, might seem a little bit arcane and academic, but I actually think that setting it up was a really good thing for the USPTO, because most other economic agencies have had chief economist office for a long time. So the FCC, the FTC, the DOJ antitrust division has a chief economist, and typically they're academics who rotate in and out of that position. And so it struck me that if the PTO wanted to be a major player in the innovation economy, it should also set itself up with an office of the chief economist, not because the chief economist is going to be a big political player, but because they're going to be able to lay the infrastructure of evidence that's necessary for the political actors then to come in and build upon into legislation.
When you're creating a new position out of whole cloth, how do you, first of all, determine what the right KPIs would be, and then how do you find the right person for the job?
So yeah, so that was really an interesting and lucky endeavor in this case, because it happened to be the case that actually the prior administration, President George W. Bush's administration, had recommended the creation of a chief economist's office. And when I saw that, I didn't actually know that when I began transition, but then I saw that, I thought, wow, this is serendipitous, because I had been thinking about this for a while. And then David Kapos was extremely interested in the idea as well. So it became a priority, which seems sort of odd, because it's, creating another org chart kind of position doesn't seem like the most sexy thing one could do. But it became a priority for the PTO. And we knew we wanted to at least start with a tenured academic, because we wanted to set a certain tone for the position. And we got some really high-flying interest from some really high-flying players, and I was a little bit surprised because it was a completely new position. And ultimately we settled on somebody who I think was the perfect person for the job, Stuart Graham, because it turns out that some of those high flyers, high flying though they may have been, it's at the end of the day, academics aren't known for their humility typically, and some of those folks were nearly as humble as one needs to be if one is setting up a new office in government, because you need to be very patient, and because you're dealing with procurement, you're dealing with setting up a budget, so many administrative details that the near Nobel Prize winning types don't necessarily have the patience to deal with.
So you gave an interview with the New England Journal of Medicine, and you weren't very up about the Supreme Court's decision in the Amgen case. Are you more approving of them today?
Yes, I was very surprised they took the Amgen case because I thought that there was really nothing to see. I thought the Federal Circuit was really doing a good job in a hard area. And I thought, this is just such a strange case to take because the Federal Circuit, and I've had my critiques of the Federal Circuit before, but this is an area where they've just really tried to balance all of the various considerations with such exquisite care. Um, you know, what is going on here? So yes, I am more approving. Um, I mean,
Well, you
they
can't get better than 9-0.
exactly. And they seem to get it. They seem to, I mean, not that they, I think, actually understood the science, but they seem to understand that, things were being taken care of pretty well by the Federal Circuit. All was okay. There was no reason for panic.
Is this, I think, a broader sign that maybe they can get patent law right, or is it too early to say?
Oh, I think it's too early to say. I mean, I hope they take a 101 case and get it right because I don't have a lot of confidence that Congress is going to pass something. I do think we need some stabilization in 101.
What does that look like?
Um, I think it looks like um, a very clear recognition that software has to be patent eligible. I mean, we can't live in an AI dominated society and not have software be patent eligible. I think that has to. Now the challenge, of course, is business method software patent eligible. That gets more tricky. And I see the arguments for business method software not necessarily being patent eligible, but and then the line drawing then gets tricky. But I'm quite concerned that with the inability to patent software of any sort, there's going to be further retreat into secrecy, and secrecy is bad not just for innovation, but also for purposes of knowing what people are doing, even from a safety and security lens, because oftentimes you only find out what the private sector is actually up to through a patent that's issued, and then all of a sudden you realize that this is what is actually going on in the private sector.
Do you think it's also hurting the biomedical sector?
So that's a great question. I think that it potentially could be. It's I don't think that at the end of the day therapeutics are suffering, because I think at the end of the day the Myriad case really suggested that therapeutics, as long as they were somewhat isolated and somewhat purified, waving hands a little bit, that would be enough. For diagnostics, I think the jury is still out. I'm not sure. I think it's possible. And and that is particularly software enabled diagnostics, that's the double whammy, because then you get software plus the law of nature problem. So I think it's certainly possible. And I do think that some movement on both those dimensions, but perhaps particularly software, would be very welcome.
Okay. Last two questions.
Sure.
First question, mentors and mentees. There subparts to that. What does mentorship look like to you, having received mentorship, and what does mentoring look like to you? And are you mentoring in any capacity? That's for the first question. Go ahead.
Okay, so I've been very lucky. I've been incredibly embraced by senior colleagues in academia. I think our area of intellectual property is a very welcoming area, and there were so many people who helped me along the way, starting with Rebecca Eisenberg, with whom I wrote a lot in my early years, to my current colleagues, or current former colleagues, Jerry Reichman and Jamie Boyle. And so I feel like I've just couldn't have lucked out any more than I have. In terms of what good mentoring looks like, I think that it requires an ability to be both firm and open. So it gets, I guess, back to the decisive versus open-minded question. I think one needs to be firm in the sense that one needs to make clear, and I haven't always done this, and I think I sometimes have failed in this regard, make clear to the individual who's being mentored, what needs to get done in order for the process to move forward, and also what, ensure that they feel like they're on track. And so that is, as we know, getting an academic job is a difficult thing to do, and so one needs to be pretty firm about that. Where one needs to be more open-minded, I think, is in terms of not necessarily imposing your views of the world upon the individual and their writing. And so I've been pretty good about that. I think I've probably erred a little bit more on the insufficiently firm and keeping people on track side.
Are you mentoring anybody right now?
Right now, I am not. I am. I just finished a situation where I was mentoring for a few years of a visiting assistant professor, and I am thinking that there's going to be another visiting assistant professor coming through the ranks in the next couple of months who will probably be appropriate. But I don't want to reveal that person yet because I don't know how public that is yet.
Last question. 2023 and beyond, what does it look like for Arti Rai?
Oh, so I think I mentioned I have a research leave, and I couldn't be more excited. I haven't had a full research leave in 20 years, and so I couldn't be more excited about it.
Wait, that's different from a sabbatical, right? Or have you not had a break for the last 20 years?
Yeah. Well, I've been in government, but that's not really a break. That's more like, from the frying pan into the fire. So yeah, no, it is a sabbatical, yes. I guess I call it a research leave just because it's just how I think of it. But yeah, so I'm going to be doing a lot of work at the intersection of AI and biomedical innovation. So as you may know, AI is in every step of the way. AI can be a drug developer, so there are questions about whether AI should be an inventor. AI can help in the clinical trial and real-world evidence generation process. And there you get interesting issues regarding privacy and anti-discrimination law, and sometimes the two areas of law collide a little bit. And then finally, last but not least, AI can also do a lot of work in the delivery area, in the medical device area, and I've written on that in the past as well, and the secrecy issues that come up in that context. So I am planning to continue in that vein, a series of articles on AI and biomedical innovation. As I mentioned, I'm also writing an article entitled tentatively the PTAB on the choppy waters of administrative law. And every once in a while, I think, oh, I should write a book on AI and biomedical innovation, but I don't know at the end of the day whether that would be the sort of book that would either go well for an academic press, and certainly probably wouldn't go well for a popular press. So I'm not sure about that. And then finally, as I mentioned, our center is going to be doing a lot of work, as we have in the last couple of years, continuing the work on semiconductors and chips manufacturing, working with Ronnie Chatterjee as he returns from the White House.
So what I'm hearing is work, work, work. Where's the research leave? Where's the leave from work?
Well, it was the research leave, right? It wasn't the leave, it was the research leave. So yeah, so that's a really good question. You are like my older daughter. You're telling me I need to like adapt more and be I feel like I'm getting the same message in two different, very
stereo.
Yes, exactly. I'll think about it. I'll do my best to come up with something that is not work.
Well, you have plenty of time, and on all your endeavors, work or rest, we wish you all the best. Thanks so much, Arti.
Thanks so much, Daryl, for this. It was lovely, and I hope to see you soon.